Good morning, friends. My name is Lalsang Kimapachuao. I teach at Asbury Theological Seminary, and I'll be moderating this session, this final session, and to introduce my friend. And I feel that this is an honor for me to do this. Among the three plenary speakers, today's speaker, Dr. Kirsteen Kim, the Paul E. Pearson Professor of World Christianity at Fuller Seminary, is one of us, not a stranger. And therefore, I'm not going to do the usual introduction as if I'm introducing a stranger. And if you would allow me to make it a bit personal, I'm going to do it a little bit personal here. I have known about Kirsteen and her husband Sebastian since the late 1990s. I say about first here. And I think we met in person for the first time. You can confirm, or my memory may not be right, in the year 2005, when we were together at the World Mission and Evangelism Conference of the WCC in Athens. And sharing so many things in common and knowing each other from a distance, we just became good friends. That's how I felt on my side. If you get to know Kirsteen, I'm sure that what you are going to feel is quite similar. Like I felt, I just felt comfortable with her. And when introducing a book that she co-authored with her husband, Dr. Sebastian Kim, in my World Christianity class, I often say a lot about them, then time would permit me to say here. But let me just mention a few things here. The first one is about my observation of her giftedness in leadership some 15 years ago. I was a part of the Edinburgh 2010 meeting organizing committee. At one point, what I felt like we were at a standstill and we were not moving. And then at that time, Kirsteen was brought in, and whatever her position was, she just made us move. And then we had a very good conference in my estimation. And the frustration at one point was so much that maybe we may not be able to do anything much. But it was, well, others may disagree. On my side, I credited Kirsteen very much of that. The other thing that I want to say about Kirsteen is on her scholarly academic side, her ability to relate and integrate broad viewpoints, and even sometimes what I felt like maybe contrasting thoughts. Her 3 books on the theology of the Holy Spirit showed this, in my opinion. I think she has written at least 3 on this, and I might have missed others. If it were not for these works, I would not have related the Holy Spirit with Indian pluralist theologians like Stanley Samartha, an Indian, I would call liberationist theologian like Samuel Ryan, and eccentric and mystic, in my opinion, Sister Vandana Mataji. On the one side, this kind of diverse scholars. On the other side, charismatic and Pentecostal, and that ability is what I see in Kirsteen. Leslie Newbegin once said, every Christian must be both evangelical and ecumenical. Kirsteen is one of those who embodies that very well among the people that I know. Her simultaneous leadership in the Lausanne movement and the CWME, by which I mean Commission on World Mission Evangelism, of the WCC clearly showed that. So today, we're going to hear what does unity look like, models, a reconsideration of models in view of world Christianity, drawn skillfully and creatively from a rich well of experience and in-depth knowledge. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kirsteen Kim to the podium to deliver what she has prepared for us.
So, it's good to see everybody, and thank you for your time. And I'm going to slightly problematize some of our discussions around unity. I hope you will bear with me. My husband Sebastian Changwan Kim and I have been joining the peaceful demonstrations in downtown Pasadena, California, against President Trump's behavior and various policies of his administration. Mingling with the crowd, we are learning the chants that channel the energy of the gathering. One of the most repeated slogans is a call and response. And this is all new. I'm relatively new to the US, so this is all new to me, but you probably all know it. Tell me what democracy looks like. Okay, great, yes, that's the idea. Looking round at the crowd of several thousands of all ages and ethnicities from many sections of society and raising many issues on their homemade placards, the demonstrations do indeed seem to exemplify democracy. Being there made me wonder how the slogan would sound and how the crowd would look if unity was the focus. Tell me what unity looks like. It doesn't scan quite as well, but tell me what unity looks like. Yes, it does indeed. From this perspective. So from our text on world Christianity coming out in a third edition in September, I've identified 6 different ways in which Christians from various parts of the world and in a number of different contexts in history have called for and demonstrated unity. Unification under pressure. Church unity for wider unity. Unity for protection, visible unity, unity for mission, and unity of relationships. In this lecture, I will look at some of these examples and show that, although theologically imperative, in practice, what constitutes unity is a highly complex issue. I will ask first, who is calling for unity and to what end? And second, who decides what unity looks like, and what did Jesus have in mind in those verses from John's Gospel that we've been thinking about such a lot? I argue that some forms of unity may actually be detrimental to the church and undermine Christian witness, while other expressions of unity that are exclusive may make sense when understood within a particular context. I will also question whether church or mission structures should be thought of as the primary way of expressing unity. And I propose that Christian togetherness across diversity may be a more authentic witness than a corporate approach, as we are becoming what Pope Francis called a community of missionary disciples. So first, who is calling for unity and to what end? Sorry, that's the slide I was looking for. So my first model is unification under political pressure. From even before Caesar Augustus called a census, governments have sought to control religion by registration and regulation. States recognize that religion is a powerful force that can challenge imperial power, as was demonstrated in the early church when claiming that Jesus is Lord could be heard as a challenge to the lordship of Caesar. In addition, from the perspective of the authorities, religion can easily get out of hand. We heard some of that in the Asbury revival example from Matthew in the worship. Religions are easier to control if they are unified, so that there's only one figurehead for the religion or one church body to deal with. Imperial control may be exercised by the state or through proxies like Herod at national, local, or church level. In calling the Council of Nicaea, the Emperor Constantine aimed to unify the church, which he saw as a means of keeping his empire united. However, his efforts to bring unity began the process that established Christendom, in the sense of lands where Christianity is the only permitted religion, and where churches have the backing of imperial force to coerce people into the kingdom. This state of negative peace, in which Europeans were told what unity looks like, continued for centuries. The Protestant reformers, too, made settlements with powerful European princes to establish national churches from which defection could be punished. And as European empires expanded globally in the modern period, they sought to count religious adherents and organize them in ways that they could control. Some modern examples of governments pressurizing churches to unify for the state's convenience also come from East Asia. In the modern period, the Japanese imperial government encouraged the registration of the population with a designated religion. As militarism increased in the 1930s, the government forced the Protestant denominations to combine into the United Church of Christ in Japan, known as the Gyodan. Korea had been annexed by Japan in 1910, so Korean churches too were required to join the Gyodan, although many decided to go underground to resist this. In Korea, the liberation from Japan in 1945 resulted in the disintegration of the Gyodan and a split in the indigenous Presbyterian Church between those who had resisted the Japanese and those who had collaborated. However, in Japan itself, although some groups pulled out, the Gyodan, though compromised, survived into the democratic period, reflecting an earlier desire by Japanese church leaders for unity and freedom from Western denominations. In view of these contrasting examples, it's important to ask who is calling for unity and what kind of power do they wield to enforce it. Does the proposed unity come from within the churches themselves or from outside? Does this kind of unity address injustices, or is it being coerced? As in the case of Constantine, some movements for Christian unity are motivated by a belief that unity among Christians can bring about wider social unity. This ambition can be both benign and also malign. I won't say which applies where because it's also ambiguous. In a recently published work, Dana Robert and Judith Becker show how the young Protestant ecumenists of the late 19th and early 20th centuries were enthused by the possibility of bringing peace to the whole world. Of course, in that era, in which European empires controlled most of the planet, peace between the national churches of Europe would not only prevent war at home, but also globally. Furthermore, the conversion of India, Japan, and other large non-Western nations was believed to be a real possibility. In the next few decades, internationalist ecumenists used imperial structures to organize conferences to gather Christian leaders from different countries across the lines of nation and denomination. World peace was not forthcoming. And this colonial vision was not realized. But the World Council of Churches emerged, and paradoxically, it enabled churches from colonized regions to decolonize that vision. The most egregious example of nationalist unity, of course, is that of the German Christians who cast in their lot with Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich. However, not all complicity with nationalisms can be unequivocally condemned. Nationalism helped nations win independence, and as European empires were forced to relinquish their colonies, nationalism supported nation building. In India, indigenous Christians also wanted to support independence and their new nation, which leading Indian theologian M.M. Thomas argued was already the work of Christ through Christian mission. Although some church leaders saw the formation of united churches in India as a colonial project, Congregational, Presbyterian, Reformed, Methodist, and even Anglican churches came together in 1947, the year of Indian independence, as the Church of South India. Further unifications and working relationships additionally enable India's churches to have a unified voice and to bear public witness. Sometimes Christians face a dilemma about whether to focus nationally or to engage internationally. A second split in the Korean Presbyterian Church happened in the 1950s about whether or not to join the World Council of Churches. The nationalists had a suspicion that the WCC was controlled by people who did not have South Korean interests at heart. This was unfortunately confirmed when, at the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950, the WCC at first supported the Allies against communist aggression, but then backtracked under pressure from member churches behind the Iron Curtain. Nowadays, whenever there is an international conference in Korea, nationalist Christians protest what they see as a threat to conservative Korean Christianity, or Protestantism particularly. One of the categories used by Gina Zerlo and Todd Johnson in the World Christian Encyclopedia is independent churches. Not only do such churches reject or resist unity with other churches, but many of them are also exclusive in their membership, which raises questions from others about whether they can be considered fully Christian. Here I identify briefly three forms of Christian exclusivism that could be considered legitimate when you think about their particular contexts. And those forms are self-isolation, dissent, and resistance. So first, self-isolation. Some of these independent churches are underground because they fear persecution if discovered. For underground churches, wider relations are an existential threat because they risk infiltration or exposure. In India, the goal of Hindu nationalists is to make Hinduism the established religion and to exclude Muslims, Christians, and followers of any other religion that did not originate in the Indian subcontinent. Consequently, increasingly, foreign associations risk harm to Christian communities in the form of harassment, discrimination, and even violence. To counteract this, Indian Christians work to show that Christianity is Indian, Christianity made in India. Sometimes this means rejecting missions, aid, and visits by Christians from other countries. I'm not saying this is always the case in India, but it's an example. Second, as Protestants are bound to affirm, sometimes dissent can be the only conscientious course. After all, a group that is rejected by the mainstream is not necessarily in the wrong. Jehu Hansels argues that the Anglophone tolerance of dissent from the established church created a pattern of diverse independent churches that continues today, including in the global Pentecostal charismatic movement. A further example is African independent churches. although in fact many of the churches that white observers described as breakaway from the colonial churches may not themselves have been dissenting. They were excluded from the colonial churches who found their powerful indigenous leadership and worship styles unacceptable. And then, sorry, I've already got it there. And then third, resistance is a course taken reluctantly by Christians who see or suffer injustice and find no other recourse for addressing it. In Buried Seeds, my Fuller colleague Alexia Salvatierra and her co-author justify the exclusivity of base ecclesial communities of liberation theology on the grounds that they existed to enable the oppressed communities to gather away from their oppressors. They compare this to the African-American hush harbors of an earlier generation, that were for enslaved people only. Sometimes exclusivity is for self-preservation. The examples in this section remind us that unity and disunity among churches are often under the pressure of wider political and societal tensions. At Nicaea, while Constantine urged unity for political reasons, internally the bishops addressed unity theologically using the concept of heresy and their newfound power. Since then, heresy has seeded disunity between churches. However, historians will draw our attention to the cultural, social, political, and economic factors behind the Protestant Reformation, for example, or the factors that influence the separation of US Protestant denominations into North and South as much as 40 years before the Civil War. In hindsight, interpreting schisms in light of external conditions can help us to overcome them. For example, in the recent cases of the ecumenical acceptance of the Oriental Orthodox churches, which is what the other book is about, and agreement between the Catholic Church and the Lutheran World Federation about justification. So the second question, who decides what unity looks like? We have seen that unity promoted by powerful people and for their interests is justifiably resisted by others for reasons of safety, conscience, and self-determination. A further question to ask then is, who decides what unity looks like, and what did Jesus have in mind? I'm not pretending to be able to answer that question. Earlier ecumenists tended to lament Christian plurality as a fragmentation of some original unity. Bill Gregory referred yesterday to Leslie Newbigin's book with the title The Reunion of the Church, as if it had been one thing in the first place. However, from a historical perspective, world Christianity studies have drawn attention to diversity at the very beginnings of the church's history. The early church, like Pentecostal charismatic Christianity more recently, seems to have arisen in a polycentric or polygenic way through the churches of the Jewish dispersion or diaspora. The World Council of Churches founding documents committed to visible unity on the theological grounds that the church is, in essence, one, and that unity needs to be declared and demonstrated as a sign of the Trinity. Visible unity was expected to mean organic or corporate convergence, and those meant the same thing, around matters of doctrine first, followed by structural unity. The most prominent ecumenical success stories were unions of denominations, as in South India. Denominations are a relatively recent form of structural unity, arguably a US invention, so that they represent churches that feel the need for structural unity in order to become visible in the sense of becoming public institutions. So actually, in a way, they were a form of unity, although we often think of them as a form of disunity. However, independent churches may follow a free church or congregational model. They have a relationship with the wider world that is countercultural, and they rarely engage in civil society or in the public square. Nevertheless, they may respect the invisible or spiritual unity of the true people of God, an idea derivable from Augustine or more directly Calvin, and that is sufficient for them in this world. As an example of the clash between these two ecclesial models, structural and spiritual, about 20 years ago in England, I was tasked with reporting on relations between the Anglican churches in the London borough of Kingston and the then 20,000 strong Korean community that had its own churches, some denominational, most house churches, some hybrid. I was shocked by how many Anglican clergy questioned why Korean immigrants formed separate churches and expected instead that they would join the Church of England. Well, why wouldn't you? This showed little reflection on the reasons why Korean Christians gathered separately, or respected, and nor did it show respect for Korean people's decisions. Those most steeped in ecumenism held an ideology that insisted on structural unity at the expense of other considerations. Since there are also Anglican churches in Korea, the attitude was unjust as well as paternalistic. In practice, corporate unity has been limited. For example, the Catholic Church declined to become a member of the World Council of Churches. Unions of denominations in the West were often driven by economic weakness, and unfortunately they led to more denominations, not fewer, since inevitably some groups of churches did not become part of the new entity. In addition, by the 1970s, the call for a moratorium on missions by the All Africa Conference of Churches and the emergence of regional third world theologies that questioned Western theology revealed the post-colonial challenges to closer union. Together with the demise of structuralism as a philosophy, such issues encouraged ecumenical attention to turn from the institutional church to other visible expressions of unity, where common words and deeds can be seen. Examples are the charismatic movement, which cut across all the global Christian traditions. Liberation theology, which energized collaboration for social goals, regardless of denominational affiliation. Interreligious forms of ecumenism, and diasporic churches. To accommodate other forms of unity, in the British context, the British Council of Churches, you can imagine what that was like, dissolved in 1990 to found a network, Churches Together, which could be much more inclusive, including of the Catholic Church and more recent immigrant churches. Visible unity could be by togetherness, in which the world can see in us the love of the Father and the Son for the world, John 13:35. Another model of unity, I've just got this one and one more to go, is unity in or for mission. This model is usually based on Jesus' prayer in John 17, which indicates that the motive of unity is so that the world may believe or so that the world may know. Although ecumenical pronouncements made unity and mission flip sides of the same coin, in 20th century ecumenism they were used as to stress church unity particularly. The World Missionary Conference in 1910 had stimulated ecclesial unity However, the more immediate outcome of its discussion of cooperation and the promotion of unity was cooperation in mission practice and strategy. On the ground, cooperation gradually became a major expression of Christian unity around the world, and this continued for the next century, outlasting schemes of structural unity, church unity. Whatever the form of cooperation in the 20th century, of course, it was informed by human models, and these were especially from the colonial, or in the second half of the century, the business world, the American world. After the Second World War, partnership, a term first used by British colonial governments during the transition to independence, became the main way of expressing cooperation in within the International Missionary Council and the World Council of Churches, and in ecumenical development work. Partnership continues to be employed, even though it is questionable whether, given the economic disparities, partnership between churches in the global north and south is, or ever can be, equal. Harking back to the protests mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, it is not in the believing or the telling that unity is realized, but in the demonstration. Despite the origins of ecumenism in mission, it was not until 2013 that an official WC statement recognized that and actually grounded unity in mission. In contrast to the preceding statements, all the preceding statements by the WCC Faith and Order Commission, which essentially began, "In the beginning was the church," this document, after some pressure from the Commission on World Mission and Evangelism, this document begins by setting church unity within the context of Missio Dei. Quite remarkable, although it doesn't actually carry that through the rest of the document, in my opinion. That's work to be done. The global evangelical movement, which is composed mainly of independent churches, could not be easily accommodated in the structures of the World Council of Churches, because those were national structures. Moreover, by the mid-century, neo-evangelicalism in the US did not even want to associate with what its leadership described as a theologically liberal or even communist organization that had lost its commitment to the Bible and world mission. For such reasons, and also perhaps because the World Council of Churches opposed segregation, most evangelical churches have never joined the World Council of Churches. Instead, evangelicals founded alternatives to the WCC, notably the Lausanne Committee for World Evangelization. The first Lausanne Congress in 1974 similarly looked back to Edinburgh 1910 and called for unity because our oneness strengthens our witness, just as our disunity undermines our goal of reconciliation. That's a quote. However, evangelicals played down structural unity in favor of regional and functional cooperation for strategic planning, for mutual encouragement, and for sharing of resources and experience. Perhaps in an attempt to overcome suspicion of partnership, the most recent Lausanne Congress in Seoul in 2024 used the contemporary business model of collaboration. Indeed, the Congress itself was set up to achieve this, both through in-person interaction and digital engagement. However, compared to partnership, collaboration suggests a more short-term cooperation with a more specific aim and less commitment, and therefore, in a sense, a lower level of unity. Ultimately, neither cooperation, nor collaboration, nor partnership are unity. But they can be visible, and they do presume important components of unity, such as mutual recognition, a willingness to receive from the other, and some solidarity toward a shared end. However, we do not freely cooperate, partner, or collaborate with others unless we know and trust them to a certain extent. and unless we perceive the benefits to be mutual. Therefore, the formation of relationships must come first. And the fellowship, of course, the fellowship of the Holy Spirit is a gift of God, and relationships cannot be forced. Dana Roberts' book, Faithful Friendships, shows the possibility and potential of friendships across boundaries for building fellowship. She argues that friendship is the life of the kingdom and that it implies equality. And she points to historical examples of friendship, starting with the Jesuits. When, at the Edinburgh 1910 conference, V.S. Azaria called on Western missionaries to become friends, the negative reaction in the room confirmed that most Western missionaries were not inclined to treat Indian Christians on equal terms. He was booed. Nevertheless, friendship became significant in the ecumenical movement. Western mission boards and agencies gradually recognized that the churches they founded overseas could not be controlled from headquarters in the West, nor was that desirable. And the International Missionary Council underwent and bequeathed a learning process that is still transforming the paternalistic relationship between the older and the younger churches, so-called. The WCC described itself from its foundation as a fellowship of churches, and using the Catholic model, it has recognized denominational church families and world communions. However, around 1991, for reasons that I won't explain at the moment, the Council was challenged by the Orthodox churches within it to demonstrate its ecclesial koinonia by changing its decision-making processes to include minority communities. Following this, a new model of unity emerged as reconciled diversity, in which confessional distinctives are retained and respected. However, while there is a sense of fellowship or family within those world communions, given that the Protestant confessions all arose within Western Europe, their internal unity is strongly challenged. For example, there have been global north-south splits in the Anglican Communion and in the United Methodist Church in recent years. So, moving to a conclusion. In a fractured society, the Church's mission of peacemaking and ministry of reconciliation behooves us to break down walls and cross boundaries. There are times when churches need to be exclusive, but in general, as Pope Francis reminded us, the Church's doors are open as it goes forth. William Gregory records that Pope Francis urged fraternity across all lines of human difference and friendship among diverse groups of people. The resultant community of missionary disciples is, in the words of Stephen Bevans, a continuing creation, with mission as its essence, community as its mystery, and discipleship as its structure. Here, too, the power question is vitally important. Any initiative of peace and reconciliation must be questioned if it passes too quickly over issues of justice. My Fuller colleague, Daniel Lee, argues that even attempts to construct multiracial churches can do this and actually make their congregants less aware of structural racial realities as a consequence. Community, both locally and globally, can only be built through friendship, through relationships and consensus. As churches grow in Latin America, Africa, and parts of Asia, global mission movements arise from these new centers. These crisscross the globe in multiple directions, from everywhere to everywhere. The existence of 4 canonical Gospels attests that there has always been more than one expression of community discipleship and faithfulness to Christ's commission. As Christianity lives up to its inherent diversity, structural unity, in my view, becomes even less likely. Moreover, given global inequities, there will always be the suspicion that appearances of unity are not equitable or are for unholy ends. So I've argued that apparent unity may be at the expense of other considerations such as justice, freedom, and apostolicity. International unity may be a threat to national unity and vice versa. For the sake of vulnerable Christian communities, independence and exclusivity should be respected. Visible unity is not necessarily always, doesn't have to be structural. Working together may not be the fullest expression of unity, but it may be a very good step on the way. And authentic unity is community that can only be built through relationship. In view of this, in deciding whether to participate in a movement for unity, we should ask, who is promoting this unity and to what end? My skepticism does not mean that we shouldn't look for ways to witness in unity as we discern where the Holy Spirit is at work, so that we may join in. But that unity must be voluntary and mindful of minorities. There will never be a single structurally unified church because that's not the nature of Christianity. Moreover, there should never be a single world church because that would be Babel. And Pentecost is not a reversal of Babel, but an endorsement of Christian diversity. As Willie Jennings explains, at Pentecost, unity of language is not forced on minorities as English and other colonial languages are. Instead, each people's own language is affirmed. Even without organic corporate structural unity, we can demonstrate visible unity. This is achievable, and even more so in mission work than in the institutional church. As at Pentecost and afterwards, the sight of Christians loving and serving together for the good of the community is in itself a powerful witness. So if I hear the call, tell me what unity looks like, the response, this is what unity looks like, should come from a crowd like the one in Revelation 7:9, of many tribes, nations, and tongues, a verse that is so often invoked in the discourse of world Christianity. But I do want to leave you with a couple of quotations. The first is from Tinyiko Maluleke, who spoke in what he said at Edinburgh in 1910, which seems amazingly pertinent today. The Revelation 7 vision is only realizable among and between fully equal human people, men and women of all cultures and orientations. Until we can acknowledge that black is as human as white, that woman is as human as man, Palestinian is as human as Canadian, American is as human as Iranian, we cannot hope to see the fulfillment of the vision of Revelation 7. I think I'll leave it there. Thanks.